Thank you very much for inviting me to give the talk. I'm excited to share this collection with you all. I'm going to talk today about the Eckstein Albums, a collection of photographs taken by a German Jewish migrant to the early Turkish Republic. These albums were donated to the Skeleton Center for Ottoman Studies in 2018 and digitized in 2020. I'll show a selection of the photographs throughout, but you can browse all the photographs on the Cambridge Digital Library platform if you follow the URL at the bottom of the screen here. So these photographs, most of them were taken on a pediatrician's tour of rural Turkey. And I've included a selection that I hope demonstrate how this source material can provide a snapshot view of public health and hygiene, medicine and hospitals, housing and nation building, women, infants and children, and education in the early Turkish Republic. So to give you some background to the photographer, first of all, in June 1935, German pediatrician Albert Eckstein received a letter signed by Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, withdrawing him from services to the Prussian government. He sought refuge elsewhere, and after two potential offers, one from Glasgow and one in America, he settled on a contract from the Turkish government. The Turkish Republic would maintain a neutral stance for most of the Second World War and invite other Jewish doctors, engineers, and academics to help construct the new state. Albert Ekstein was an expert in preventative pediatrics and an ideal candidate for the ambitious health agenda of the Turkish Republican government. And the Eksteins were a family of doctors. Albert's wife, Erna, was also a pediatrician. He took over from her father, Arthur Schlossmann, as head of the children's ward in Düsseldorf Municipal Hospital. Their son, Herbert, returned to Ankara University Medical Faculty in 1957. And another son, Peter, became professor of reproductive endocrinology at the University of Birmingham. These albums contain almost 1,000 photographs and document the tour taken by Albert and Erna Eckstein in the late 1930s. Over the course of their trip, the Ecksteins worked in 60 villages and examined 8,000 women. So that's 1/3 of the female population that they visited. Their tour, following Turkey's second census in 1935, has been described as probably the first attempt to collect statistics on the health and demographics of a major segment of Turkey's population. Records of women were particularly significant here because they were heavily underrepresented in the Ottoman equivalent of censuses, because one of the primary aims of that form of registration was male conscription and taxation. The Ecksteins' stay in Turkey coincided with a period of radical reforms in public health, education, transport, and other national infrastructure. And I'm going to look first at public health and hygiene reforms. So Ekstein arrived in Turkey as the Republic was approaching its 12th birthday, celebrating the radical reforms that were already underway and reminding everyone of the odds stacked against their success. On the eve of the Republican holiday, Cumhuriyet Bayramı, national newspaper Ulus, owned by the ruling party, reported that in 12 years, these people have done more than it is possible to do. In 1919, there were only a few people in the whole world who didn't believe that the Turkish people were nearing their end. In the duration of Eckstein's stay in Turkey, the rate of infant mortality fell from 33% to 12%. The new government had embarked on a targeted epidemiological strategy to replenish its population after many years of war. So that's the Ottoman-Italian War in Libya 1911 to 12, the Balkan Wars 1912 to 13, followed by World War I, and then followed by the National Liberation War. This responsibility was felt widely, and Ekstein appears to have adopted the Turkish public health effort as his own. His assistant, Dr. Selahattin Tekand, recalled that Ekstein used the first-person plural biz to convince a young Turkish doctor of their shared responsibility to work in Anatolia. His expertise in preventative paediatrics was incredibly effective, and his research was no doubt aided by an open, warm manner that elicited the smiles captured in his photographs. The albums have been digitized as Eckstein mounted them, displaying his curatorial sensibilities and sensitivity to cultural themes across villages, alongside the multilingual captions of a migrant in exile. So in response to a low life expectancy that was a direct result of war for adult men and disease in children, Ekstein considered his medical work as a post-war call to arms. And I'll just read from the slide now a quote that he wrote in the British Medical Journal. "Malaria is one of the greatest scourges of the tropics and subtropics. The loss of infant life is appalling. Russia, the Balkans, Poland, Italy, Spain, and Holland are countries where the disease may become pandemic. With the shifting of large population groups, districts and countries that have happily escaped hitherto may find themselves faced with this dread disease. Now that the hounds of war have been leashed, there still remains the battle against disease. Combined operations have proved their worth in war. And so in peace, it will be the active and energetic cooperation between hygienist, obstetrician, and paediatrician that will reduce the heavy infant casualties from malaria." The photographs that accompany Ekstein's medical practice contribute to this peacetime collaboration, a visual account of the living conditions that could foster a healthy population or harbour festering illness. Eckstein's commission was as much a nationalist project as a medical inquiry, and the albums are evidence of a holistic view of epidemiology and preventative healthcare. They shed light on the socio-economic conditions of Turkey's rural population in the early years of the Republic's existence, on its ethnographic profile and family structure, and on the role of women and children in farming and family life. There are no photos of broken bones or clinical shots of infections. Instead, the symptoms documented by Ekstein are water fountains, railways, watermelon harvests, open markets, and children sorting tobacco leaves. His primary subjects are women and infants, and he captures them in their architectural surroundings. So these are backdrops that demonstrate the importance of housing to health and hygiene, and of statues and symbols to nation building. And Albert Eckstein's tour contributed to all of these elements, taking part in an industrious propaganda campaign on hygiene. The 1930 General Hygiene Law took radical steps to combat malaria, trachoma, and tuberculosis through preventative medicine, and pure water supply was a key topic in pamphlets issued by the Ministry of Health. The significance of water sources to the health of a population is evident in Ekstein's reports and reflected in his photography. In his 1937 diary, Ekstein records a train journey to Yerköy and describes how, as they travelled across the steppe towards Ankara, they had a break at Little Yozgat, where the passengers disembarked and filled their clay jugs with fresh water from the station fountain. Ekstein's records of malaria and enteritis in each village are accompanied in charts by descriptions of the water source, such as well, fountain, or creek, in each province, demonstrating how central water sources were to everyday activities of village life and the impact that they could have on public health. But farm work was not always compatible with hygiene. Mahmut Makal, who initiated the village literature movement, described in Bizim Köy how, in the heat of summer during the harvest, farm workers avoided washing their hands to prevent soreness and cracking. Agriculture was bodily work, as demonstrated by the men standing in a trough of grapes to prepare pekmez, or molasses, in this picture. Ekstein realised that there was more to medical hygiene than bodily cleanliness, and his photographs also document the importance of sanitary measures in food production. These photographs are evidence of the grand-scale agricultural production of rural Anatolia. The region was not only the ideological heartland of the new republic, but also responsible for feeding the nation. This was a period in which Turkish agricultural production soared, and these albums demonstrate the variety of goods produced, from the logging industry in Bolu to boats loaded with watermelons in Antalya. The Republic had to win over the hearts and minds of a largely rural population whose previous experience of state visitors had been Ottoman recruiting officers and tax collectors. So in this context, doctors appeared as government agents as much as healthcare professionals. Dr. Fehmi remarked on changes in villagers' attitudes across the 10-year span of the health campaign. In the 1920s, mass examinations had required police intervention, and many villagers were fined or imprisoned if they refused to submit. In the 1930s, they came willingly for their free supply of quinine, armed with requests for motor pumps to drain stagnant ponds and government tools to dig canals, updates on the building of bridges and dikes, and requests for screenings on films of malaria and trachoma. A village muhtar, as depicted in this picture with Ekstein, kept a note of the fortnightly quinine rations alongside the records of the doctor's assistants. So local collaboration on medical matters could have been motivated by the doctor's connection to government-funded infrastructural change. By the time that Albert and Erna Ekstein embarked on their tour in 1937, there had been a cultural shift in the attitudes of the villagers. Ekstein's photographs confirmed that doctors were welcomed and chime with Erna's reports that women were, quote, neither shy nor retiring. They spoke freely and gave clear answers. The principal diseases that Ekstein tackled were caused by malnourishment, as well as typhoid and diarrhea. He was also instrumental in reducing from 90% to 7% the mortality rates of noma, which destroyed facial bones and muscles and proved fatal to children already weakened by malaria or measles. While the government had great success with malaria and trachoma, Erna recalls that the rapidly growing infrastructure that helped modernize Anatolia, such as improved means of transport, and this photograph shows the building of railway tracks in Mudanya, also had the devastating effect of spreading tuberculosis to remote villages whose sparse settlements had previously protected their populations from the infectious disease. In 1930s Ankara, the Numune Hospital stood as a bold monument to the Republic's commitment to healthcare. The paediatric clinic where Ekstein was hired to work would set an example for the rest of the nation. His 1938 photographs of the clinic include pavilions named for the second president of the Republic, İsmet İnönü, and Minister of Health, Refik Saydam. These photos also hint at the novelty of their urban grandstanding. The built-up landscape peels off at the edge of the hospital buildings, and the donkey ambulance shows that the rural was never very far away. The lack of development around the edge of the medical complex also gives a sense of the priority that health took in national infrastructure. 1927 saw the opening of the 50-bed Refik Saydam Hospital, with buildings planned by Viennese architect Robert Early and works carried out by Vehbi Koç and German company Yeliski Tekelman. So, alongside his former compatriots, Ekstein appears to have shared a professional pride, snapping the buildings from various angles and tracing the medical discipline back to its archaeological remains at Pergamon, with photographs of an ancient hospital in ruins. Then moving on to housing and nation building. Housing was crucial to the health of a village's inhabitants. In many parts of central Anatolia, shelter from the extreme cold would make all the difference to surviving a harsh winter or recovering from illness. One village report recommended an increase in the number and size of windows, the cleaning of stables, especially those found near residences, the separation of stable and residence with a door between huts, and the frequent cleaning of ablution canals and wells for the sake of the villagers' health. Ekstein's medical survey coincided with huge investment in infrastructure and a recognition of the role that architecture might play in keeping the elements out, separating people from pests and enabling the hygiene and cleanliness that government propaganda sought to inspire. Many of these people left their villages to celebrate the national holiday, and Ekstein's photos of Cumhuriyet Bayramı show his subjects' engagement with nation building, not as idealized peasants, but as active celebrants. Here are villagers from the rural outskirts of Ankara heading to the capital on donkeys, bearing flags, to join the aeronautic celebrations of the national holiday. Eckstein's collage composition conjures some of the excitement of the day. Newspaper reports also describe a human flood and the arrival of, quote, a crowd of all ages and from every profession with packets of food in their hands, filling the station road, piling into the stands and eagerly anticipating the arrival of Ataturk. Ulus reported that the holiday was celebrated all over the country, with the opening of a new railway station in Isparta, lantern parades in Kayseri, processions in Bolu, and markets, shops and houses decked out with red flags all over Konya. The role of women was a crucial component of the Republic's identity. Erna Ekstein writes that she knew of women doctors, women teachers, even women lawyers. Women's work was especially significant after the war. There were approximately 1 million widows recorded in the 1927 census. And the combination of labour and childcare began early in life, and these albums show girls as young as 12 weaving their carpets with an infant sibling in their laps. Traditional female factory work, such as preparing tobacco, was accompanied by compulsory courses in reading, writing, and general knowledge. And Eckstein's portraits depict bold, smiling, working women who appear unafraid to pose for a foreign male doctor. His portraits of working women were exhibited in the Turkish pavilion of the New York World Fair in 1939. Erna recalls that her husband's pictures were chosen to represent Turkey abroad because, quote, he was the only one up to then who had been able to take good pictures of women. The women were, in general, bashful and would not, for reasons of religion, let themselves be photographed. So the early Republic took pride in women's contributions to nation building, but these accolades came with a great deal of responsibility, and government publications also blamed Turkish mothers who failed to protect their children from disease. Childcare manuals instructed pregnant women not to travel in shaky carts on uneven roads or on trains in the 1st or 8th month of pregnancy, to keep away from the births of other pregnant women, and to avoid wearing tight or fashionable clothes or visiting crowded places. For Dr. Reşit Galip, addressing the women charged with repopulating a nation, there was no crime more serious than abortion, which, according to Dr. Reşit Galip, often dragged confused and heartless women to the grave, along with the innocent children they tried to abort. Government publications urged women who were expected to have difficult births to deliver their babies in maternity wards or hospitals. Makal paints a bleak picture of the lives of Turkish girls, for whom he wrote marriageable age begins at 13, though Ekstein records it as averaging 14 before the revolution and 18 in 1937. Makal writes, one can hardly number the dark-eyed brides who die in childbirth, before their time, still young and in heartbreaking circumstances, leaving their relatives and the village stricken with grief. Indeed, Eckstein's table reports that for every 100 women aged between 20 and 24 at the time of his report, there were 210 children born, of which 41 died and 169 survived. Whereas for every 100 women aged between 45 and over at the time of the report, there'd been 687 children born, of which 310 died and 377 survived. The differences between the two age brackets suggest a gradient of improved healthcare, with infant mortality dropping from 45% to less than 20% in the course of one generation. Albert had previously noted the difficulty of ascertaining accurate infant mortality rates, as there was often no record of the babies who died soon after birth. The Eckstein's method of interviewing village women personally could have helped with this lack of data, and Erna notes that women knew the number of their dead and surviving children. The subjects of Eckstein's survey often featured in nationalist art of the time, such as this painting, Anne ve Çocuk, by Bedri Rahmi Eyüboğlu, and his photographs might be considered a contribution to the imagery of the Kemalist project. Eckstein's portraits of women breastfeeding document one of the most important ways in which mothers were expected to protect and nourish the nation's children. Dr. Reşit Galip announced that the primary duty of every mother is breastfeeding the child. Figures for the length of time spent breastfeeding range from 1 to 1.5 years in one village, to Eckstein's own diary reports of infants breastfed for up to 2 years, and occasionally up to 4, perhaps as an unreliable form of contraception. Writing on the Summer Diarrhea of Children in Ankara in 1938, Ekstein remarks that breastfed infants fared better than their older weaned siblings who suffered from malnutrition, and they also fared better than Western European children from comparable backgrounds, who were more likely to suffer from rickets and tetany. Erna also observed a cultural difference between Western European and Turkish women in that the latter nursed on demand, writing that infants were not fed at defined times. As soon as they stirred, the mother would put them to her breast. As a result, one heard little crying. Children were central to plans for population growth, and Ekstein's medical career is testament to the strides they made in reducing infant mortality and the spread of disease. Ekstein used data from the 1935 census to argue that the public policy of Turkey should concentrate on its youngest generations, who formed the largest portion of the population. Although he noted a lack of 15 to 19-year-olds, which was a result of the low birth rate in the war years, and that would likely lead to a temporarily decreased birth rate in the years ahead, he was confident that they would catch up again soon after. And on average, Turkish women bore more than the 4 children each required to replace the population after years of high mortality. Children were also crucial as a symbol of the nation, and Ekstein's photographs bear witness to the reorientation of a national gaze towards its youngest citizens, to the tantalizing hope of the future they promised and that modern Turkish society promised them. The new generation had never known the Ottoman Empire or its collapse, which, Ulus warns, threatened to take the people and nation with it. Children were symbols of the life and continuity, or hayat ve devam, that the newspaper extolled because, and quote, those who are children cannot remember the dark days of the post-war occupation. And the Turkish Republic was a young nation demographically as well as constitutionally. A large proportion of the population of the vilayets pictured in these albums were under 14 years old. 42% in Amasya, 43% in Çorum and Malatya, 41% in Sivas and Yozgat. In contrast, only 26.35% of Istanbul's population was under 14. The former Ottoman capital was the anomaly in this case, skewed by the number of unmarried adult workers who had migrated from the villages and the lower birth rate associated with improved living conditions. The rural districts are a far better indication of the overall national demographics and a general population of which 41% was aged between 0 and 14, over 30% was under 9, and only 6.8% was over 60 years old. Following his tour, Ekstein made clinical recommendations. In Malaria im Kindesalter, he made the case for a separate category of childhood malaria, whose clinical traits varied from adult symptoms. Childhood malaria accounted for a large proportion of child deaths between 1931 and 1934, with a 40% mortality rate, of which 8.8% were nursing babies, 18.6% infants, and 12.4% were older children. He demonstrated evidence of congenital infection following injury to the placenta during extreme malarial paroxysms, and thus recommended a prophylactic program of medication during pregnancy. He suspected that congenital malaria was more common than expected in rural areas where the disease was endemic and patients were rarely seen by doctors, particularly in the case of infants who never reached hospital. In medical journals, he also argued for the validity of occult malaria, which did not display normal symptoms in children, but which was widely known enough to have its own term in Turkish, gizli sıtma. Ekstein declared that to a baby, the cradle is the whole world, and he photographed various makeshift and outdoor ways in which these cradle worlds were incorporated into parents' lives, with bundles hung from cartwheels in Konya and constructed to shade a baby in the fields of Afyon. He wrote for La Turquie Kemaliste in 1938 that the cradle is replaced often enough by a type of hammock hung from the ceiling of the house in the winters and in the shade of the trees of the house in the hot season. If the mother is in the fields, the babies are carried there along with the hammocks which are suspended in the shade of a tree or tent. And he continued, if there are older siblings, they take care of the baby with a maternal instinct, decreasing the mother's burden. This observation of sibling care also features in his 1937 diary, where Ekstein remarks that it is touching how the older girls mother the younger siblings. Consistent with many of his optimistic observations, Ekstein does not appear to critique or patronize rural child rearing, and instead finds much to admire in village children, who, he says, show independent traits in early ages and are superior to city children of identical ages in some respects. His tour also captured the significance of this generation to the Republic in its own state of rapid development. The differences between the lives of its youngest and oldest citizens would be the measure of the reform's success. Eckstein records that, while there are many people who cannot read or write in the older generation, there is no one who cannot read, write, and do arithmetic among the children of villages with a school. Therefore, children have a special status in the village. In these regions, the children are superior to the older generation many times over. Farming was a family enterprise too, and the children in Eckstein's photographs joined their parents and siblings in sorting and preparing tobacco leaves. From 1925, tobacco was a national industry with a monopoly that garnered large revenues for the state. In more urban areas, tobacco factories provided work for many, and especially many women, and they offered sick pay, maternity leave, and credit to help villagers pay off merchant debts. Women and children were also heavily involved in the production and preparation of wool and cotton. They're pictured at the looms in Denizli and spinning wool in Niğde. Makal notes that women and girls would also follow herdsmen as they drove oxen to pasture, collecting animal droppings in baskets. Ekstein captures the fruits of this labour in the dried tezek pressed against a wall to provide insulation and fuel. And then finally, looking at education, Ekstein acknowledged the public health significance of education in his charts, which lists schools alongside water sources and figures indicating the prevalence of disease in each village. İsmet İnönü's electoral address in Malatia conjured the symbolic child of the Republic once more, saying, "Today the whole country has been turned into a classroom, and the head teacher and the beloved treasure of this nation is its great son, the Ghazi." Indeed, in the early 1920s, Mustafa Kemal had adopted the guise of national teacher and toured the country with a blackboard and easel to teach villagers the new letters of the Turkish alphabet. Architectural designs to build village schools were distributed widely. 20 new village schools were opened in the Vilayet of Malatya in 1 year, but the cost of materials inhibited many of the poorest villages from completing the plans. In some cases, the agendas for health and education were explicitly combined in the creation of primary schools for children and teachers with trachoma. These quarantined institutions followed the same curriculum as other schools, so that the children enrolled there could rejoin former classmates once they had completed their course of treatment. Primary school education had to accommodate children working with the rest of their families in the fields, and so the curriculum included lessons on hygiene and agriculture. The young generations of the early Republic learned to read and write alongside grinding and ploughing, planting and spinning. And finally, to have a look at the photography and digitization, it's important to say that photographic portraits themselves are telling of this particular era in Turkish history. As much as Ekstein's individual eye is evident in his skill and curation of the images, the form is also evidence of a new Republican mode of self-representation and the choice to depict poor people in the remote countryside through the lens of the most modern media. It's hard to gauge whether the relaxed attitudes of Ekstein's photographic subjects can be attributed to their interest in the technology and willingness to embrace the modern moment with none of the qualms that might traditionally have led them to resist any capture of their likeness, or whether their open engagement was instead testament to their affection for the roaming foreign doctor who treated their children, and a desire to show their best side as he recorded their lives, which had suddenly been summoned to the foreground of national attention. The digitisation of these photographs marks a new exposure of the crucial visual evidence of the early Republic's campaign for healthy children. These albums were photographed at 600 ppi in 1:1 scale with an 80 megapixel digital back using a DT Arcam camera and a 90mm app Schneider lens. The text captions are indexed and optimized for search engine retrieval. This most modern technology also serves a historic purpose and will help to disseminate primary source material on an open public platform. And as I said, you can browse the rest of the 1,000 photographs at your leisure on Cambridge Digital Library. And I'm happy to take any questions either now or by email. And my email address is at the bottom of the screen there. And I'll stop sharing now.